Okay, so welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today for this new webinar on MISRA coding standards and the art of deviation. I am Lavinia Battaglia, CSR at BUGSENG, and our speaker is Roberto Bagnara, who, long story short, is CTO at BUGSENG, computer science professor at the University of Parma, member of the MISRA C working group and of the International Standardization Working Group of the C programming language. Before we start, please note that you can write your questions in the Q&A section throughout the entire webinar, and then at the end we will read them and reply. All right, then let's turn this over to Roberto.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's start. Today the topic is deviation, which is kind of an art, and it is a kind of art that is quite important to master if you want to do MISRA compliance work in an effective and efficient way. Here is the outline of the webinar. So we'll start with some introduction to the topic. Then we need to know about guideline categories and what is the relationship between categories and deviation. I will warn about a few of the pitfalls that deviation pose. We will see what should be in the deviation record, and then we will see several examples. And finally, we will draw some conclusion for the day. So let's start from the introduction. The deviation process is an essential part of the adoption of the MISRA guideline. And this is because the point of a MISRA guideline is very rarely saying you should not do this. So the point usually is this is a dangerous thing to be done. You may only do it if it is needed, if it is safe, and if you can easily and quickly explain to a peer that it is both needed and safe. One useful way to think about MISRA guidelines and the processes around them is to consider them a very effective way of conducting a guided peer review, guided by the tool, to rule out most of the C and C++ traps and pitfalls. The things we are talking about today are explained in detail in a document which is called MISRA Compliance 2020. It is a document that was published in February this year. It replaces a predecessor which was published in 2016. It is applicable to all versions of MISRA C 2012 and to MISRA C++ 2008. So in this presentation, I will talk about MISRA guidelines when the difference between MISRA C and MISRA C++ is not important, even though all my examples today are taken from MISRA C 2012. The adoption of the compliance document is optional for the moment, but it will become mandatory for the next editions of both MISRA C and MISRA C++. And as we discussed in the previous webinar, which you can find on our YouTube channel, there are concrete advantages in adopting this document now, even though it is still optional. The deviation process is a procedure by which justifiable non-compliance can be authorized and recorded. The exact process is not imposed in detail by MISRA Compliance 2020 because there are several factors that are left to the judgment and to the peculiarities of each organization. However, MISRA Compliance 2020 does impose constraints on the process. So the first question people often ask is, should I comply or should I deviate? And the answer is yes. It depends. There are general principles that can be followed. We will go through these principles today, but a choice has to be made on a case-by-case basis most of the times. So there are cases in which the decision involves balancing contrasting objectives, readability versus efficiency. Maybe a pretty unreadable piece of code has efficiency advantages, but you give up readability, and ideally you would like to have both to have readability and efficiency. It is possible often, but only if you use a well-done compiler, so an optimizing compiler that has no defects in the area of the language you are using. Making sensible choices requires training also, and also it requires a good tool. If you don't have a good tool, making a sensible choice amounts to a huge waste of time. Why? Because you will have, for example, you will have lots of false positives, and so you will have to investigate and decide what to do with all of these false positives. And if the tool has very few false positives, this is time that you will save. And another quite common factor is that the tool may not provide you enough information to make the good decision. So the quality of reports of the tool is also very important. One important thing that you have to take into account, and I hope to convey in this webinar, is this deviation as a cost. So the cost of deviating should be accounted carefully, and often complying is cheaper than deviating. So, as I said, all examples in this presentation concern guidelines from MISRA C 2012 revision 1 with amendment 2, so the very latest version of the coding standards. Most examples are real-life cases. I have to warn you that, of course, some degree of subjectivity remains in the choices I will present about complying or deviating. And the deviation records I will present are only sketched. So I present, I give the main idea for how to properly compile a proper deviation record. So let's start with the first poll. What best describes your position with respect to MISRA compliance? Maybe you have a managerial role in ensuring MISRA compliance on the projects of your team, or you have a development role, or maybe you are in the acquirer position. You have to evaluate MISRA compliance of projects done by third parties. And so you have to judge, are their deviation sensible or not? Are they deviating for the sake of it? Are they doing a good job?
Okay, so we have a 12%. I have managerial role in ensuring MISRA compliance for projects my team develops. 55% I have a development role in ensuring MISRA compliance, and 2% I evaluate MISRA compliance for third-party projects, and 24% I am not involved in any MISRA compliance activities.
For now, at least.
For now.
Okay. So, guideline categories and deviation. So, if for those of you who know the MISRA C 2012 guidelines, guidelines have a category which is associated. We should say a default category. And the category can be mandatory, required, or advisory. And every guideline that is given a mandatory category is a guideline that you have to comply with. So deviation is not permitted. They are a minority of guidelines that are mandatory, but they really have to be complied with, because otherwise the risks are too big. A required guideline, you can choose between complying to the guideline or raising a formal deviation. So we will later see what is a formal deviation. It's not just I deviate. I have to write a document, which may be small or big, depends on what you are deviating and what are your reasons. But if it is required, you have to either comply or raise a formal deviation. Advisory guidelines are recommendation. They should be followed as far as reasonably practical, so you can deviate them without justifications. However, you have to list all the non-compliances that are present in your code. So when you deliver the project, you have to list all the violations that remain, even for advisory guidelines. There is no other grading of importance of the guidelines in MISRA C. So all the required guidelines, independently from whether they are rules or directive, are of equal importance, and the same for the mandatory and the advisory ones. It is possible by applying MISRA Compliance 2020 to recategorize the guidelines. And at the beginning of the project, typically what happens is that the acquirer and the supplier shall agree on a guideline recategorization plan. The guidelines can be recategorized as explained in this slide. So mandatory can only remain mandatory. You cannot remap them. You cannot recategorize them, in fact. Required may be upgraded to mandatory. Advisory may be upgraded to required or mandatory. And advisory, if you adopt MISRA Compliance 2020 or even 2016, they can also downgrade it. So they can be disapplied. Disapplying them requires providing a justification for disapplication. For example, this advisory guideline is disapplied in this piece of code, which is legacy code, because checking it provides no value at all. We cannot even modify the legacy code in this case, for example. Okay, so here is an example of recategorization plan. This is taken from the document I was mentioning, MISRA Compliance 2020. You see we have Directive 1.1 that is required but has been recategorized as mandatory, and so on. So as we explained in the last webinar, where we have been talking about compliance, the fact of recategorizing guidelines is not just the acquirer that is trying to make the life of the supplier more difficult. For example, there is a guideline saying you shouldn't use recursion. Okay. However, if the acquirer only way of knowing for sure an upper bound of the amount of stack required to run the code is used by using a tool that doesn't admit recursion, so it makes a lot of sense if the guideline preventing recursion is recategorized as mandatory. Okay. Notice that there may be in the same project several guideline recategorization plans, and this is common when working with adopted code. So standard library, software of third parties, automatically generated code, and so on. So the recategorization may depend on the kind of code you apply to. So to be more precise, the category after recategorization is a property of individual reports, not a property of the guideline. For those of you that are interested, we will have a webinar on adopted code on September 3rd. So if you are interested in this topic, make sure to register. Don't rush writing the links, because all links will be sent to you by email after the webinar. So deviations and their pitfalls. It is important to understand what does it take to justify properly a deviation. And to make things clear, I would like to point out that this slide and the following one are not by me. They are by MISRA Compliance 2020, almost verbatim. So, and MISRA says that deviation must not be permitted simply to satisfy the convenience of developer. So when a reasonable alternative coding strategy would make the need for a violation unnecessary, or without considering the wider consequences, or without a suitable process to assess and authorize deviation, and without the consent of a designated technical authority. So the first point is particularly important. So there are many developers that sometimes reason by saying, oh, it's inconvenient, I will deviate. This is not a good reason for deviation. You can get away with it because the acquirer might accept this. And if everything goes well, nobody will complain. But if something goes badly, and very badly, and this is possible, as we have seen on the webinar about the Toyota sudden unintended acceleration case, then things will change. And a proposed deviation shall only be approved if it can be justified on the basis of one or more of the following: code quality, access to hardware, adopted code integration, and non-compliant adopted code. We will see example of all this for reasons that are said legitimate by MISRA to deviate. Deviation pitfalls. So advisory is not the same thing as unworthy. Okay, for example, I will explain by means of example how a rational approach can be wrong. So I have a C90 project, okay, but I still want to use / comments. The problem, I don't see the problem because I don't investigate the issue. I see that my compiler doesn't seem to complain if I use / comments. So as the rule 1.2 of MISRA C 2012 is advisory, I deviated. I don't even have to produce a formal deviation record. A slightly better approach, not so wise, I call it in this slide, is as above, but I give some thought to the issue. So first thing, I say, well, I understand / comments perfectly. And secondly, my compiler does the right thing with them. So it treats them properly, even though / comments were not part of C90. So a C90 compiler will only offer them as an extension. So first point, I understand / comment perfectly. Okay, this may be the case, but the interaction between the two kinds of comments and with line splicing, so the trailing backslashes in C, is quite complex. So before saying that you understand them perfectly, it's better if you do some check. And notice that it is actually possible to do damage because of this. So here is an example. We have a / comment, which is terminated by a backslash. And the idea of whoever wrote the comment was to express the fact that SRC is a directory. Okay, however, the backslash occurs at end of line, so this is actually line splicing. So critical function, the function code, becomes part of the comment. So it will not even be seen by later stages in the compilation process. And so critical function will not be called, which may be critical. And the other thing, my compiler does the right thing. So the question would be, did you test the compiler? Because if you have a project that has to comply with MISRA C 2012 in the C90 variety, you have to use a C90 compiler. So the C90 compiler may have been written before the / comments were standardized, and maybe the / comment have not treatment of that compiler have not been tested sufficiently. And it is a fact that different C90 compilers treat / comments differently. So what is easier? What is cheaper? Sticking to ordinary /* comments, or performing in-house testing of the compiler to make sure that / comments are handled properly? So it's advisory, but so complying in the end might be cheaper than deviating and running risks. Another pitfall of deviation is to postpone the thinking about the deviation record. So, okay, I deviate, and I will think later about the deviation record. So now I program, I decide I will deviate this. And I present here an extreme example. So Directive 4.12 saying that dynamic memory allocation shall not be used, not simply malloc and free of the standard library. Any kind of dynamic memory allocation shall not be used. And there is also a rule targeting specifically the allocation and the allocation functions provided in the stdlib standard header file. So, well, it's better to think in advance whether you are in position to deviate from those. The deviation record, for instance, will have to cover all out-of-storage runtime failures. So there are several possibilities. Is available memory demonstrably sufficient even if allocated memory is never deallocated? Then you are in not so bad position, because you need not be concerned with memory allocation errors, dangling pointers, or double free errors. However, if available memory is not sufficient without the allocation, then you will have to deallocate. So you will have to release memory when it is no longer used. So how do you do it? Do you do it with direct explicit release? So you call free? Well, then you risk dangling pointers when you release too early, memory leaks when you release too late or fail to release. You can have double free errors when you release more than once. Maybe you can use smart pointers. This is another possibility, but there is some space and time overhead that should be accounted for. There are problems with cyclic references, and it is best if you have automatic checkers to ensure that you use smart pointers consistently in your project. So these are all things to be addressed in the deviation record. So again, if available memory is not sufficient and you need to deallocate, there is another possibility, which is automatic release via garbage collection. So you will avoid dangling pointers, memory leaks, and double free errors. However, execution time will become unpredictable. So even though the stop the word effect today can be mitigated by the use of incremental garbage collector, the execution time of the garbage collector still is not easily predictable. Okay, and in general, the deviation record, if you want to deviate the guidelines concerning dynamic memory allocation, will have to take care timing consideration, because any mean of dynamic memory allocation, unless you are in a very special case, will involve the use of allocation and deallocation functions that are subject to variable latency, because free lists have to be searched and maintained, free blocks have to be searched, may be merged and moved, and the timing constraints may be such that the solution you are thinking about is not acceptable for the system you want to realize. So procrastination, I said this is an extreme example. If you want to use dynamic memory allocation, you should be prepared to write a very detailed and possibly quite long deviation record in order to justify the use of dynamic memory allocation. So deviation records. A deviation record is a document. It should, of course, contain the guideline that is being deviated, a concise description of the circumstances in which the violation is acceptable, what is the reason that deviation is required, background information to explain what are the conditions upon which this reasoning is based, and maybe a set of requirements, including any risk assessment you have to make and precautions that you may have to take to make sure that even if you have deviated, there are no risks or the risks have been mitigated. And of course, it is important to clarify where the deviation is permitted, the file or precise location or the entire project. And in fact, there are two very broad categories of deviation. Project deviation, so a guideline is deviated for the class of circumstances affecting the whole project, or a specific deviation. So a guideline is deviated just for a single instance in a single file, or, and this is much better, if the tool supports then precise, even though file and position independent specification. We will see examples about this. So a good tool will support very specific deviations that are robust with respect to code refactoring. So you can change the code, and the deviation you have specified in the tool will still apply. So let's make a couple of examples. A project deviation, there is a rule 2.5 of MISRA C 2012. A project should not contain unused macro declaration. So you may want to raise a project deviation because some of the header files included by the project are used in several projects. So the macros that are unused in this project I am analyzing now may be used in other projects, so I cannot remove them. Simple example. An example of specific deviation for Directive 4.9, a function should be used in preference to a function like macro where they are interchangeable. So I can decide that in a certain file at a certain location, a macro is used because we have verified that the compiler will produce critically inefficient code if we use a corresponding function instead of the macro. Just an example of specific deviation. Writing a deviation report requires, depending on the kind of deviation, significant work by staff that is experienced and properly trained. And so MISRA has provision to capture the more common use cases in deviation permits. So a deviation permit contains much of the material required in a deviation record. It defines a use case under which a violation may be justified. And it specifies the documentation and process requirement, which must be supplied in the deviation record. Using deviation permits is highly recommended because the supplier of a project can focus better on the generation of new deviations. So when one reason for a deviation has been studied, encoding it in a permit will allow easier reuse. It will reduce disruption during the development process because you know that you have a permit to deviate a certain guideline, reduce effort, and most importantly, you can agree with the acquirer before the project starts on the permits. And so this will reduce discussion between supplier and acquirer and make things work much more smoothly. Permits may originate from various sources. There are the MISRA consortium has published a set of permits for MISRA C 2004. We are currently working on a set of permits for MISRA C 2012. However, what should be understood is that everybody can develop a permit. You can take, for example, the MISRA C 2004 permits and use them as a scheme on how to develop your own permits. So the acquirer may already have approved permits, and so the acquirer may offer the permits to the supplier, and the supplier may have developed in-house permits, and the supplier can propose these permits to the acquirer for pre-acceptance. Here is an example of deviation permit. This is taken from MISRA Compliance 2020. So the rule is 10.6. The value of a composite expression shall not be assigned to an object with wider essential type. So the reason of this rule is to avoid the confusion that the developer may have about which type the operation is performed in. And this permit, besides listing the rule, it has a unique identifier. So it's permit example C 2012 R10.6 permit A version 1. So in which the rule is deviated in order to avoid suboptimal code generation. Then there is a background section explaining that a certain compiler generates much more efficient code if you avoid casting the operand to 32-bit before making the multiplication. So this compiler has a specific machine operation multiplying two 16-bit integers, obtaining a 32-bit result. And in order to make sure the compiler chooses that instruction, the cast that would be otherwise prescribed by the rule has to be avoided. You see that there are requirements, so these permits can only be applied to very specific cases. So the wider essential type is 32-bit, the operands are 16-bit, and so on. Okay. So here is an example of deviation record which is based on that permit. So this example is also taken from MISRA Compliance 2020, which you can download at a link we will send after the webinar. So you see that there is the project name, there is a unique identifier for the deviation, there is a status for the deviation. In this case, it has been approved. In this case, a permit has been used. It contains a rule being deviated and what is the use case, what is the reason. So it must be one of the four reasons we have seen. In this case, it is code quality with the further specification that the quality attribute of the code has to do with the time behavior. Okay. It's the scope is project, so it's in the entire project. There are tracing tags, who raised the deviation, who approved the deviation, and so on. Okay, so this is an example deviation record. It's just an example. Your organization may choose a different format, but ideally, this information, the information you see here, should be present. Okay, so time for another poll. So for the purpose of this poll, where we ask if you are involved in MISRA deviation, let's say that formal deviation is, even though it is done in a format which is very different from the example I had just shown, it's a deviation that is accompanied by a document explaining who, what, where, why, and how. And let's call an informal deviation and a deviation that is just made without accompanying information.
Okay, so the majority is not involved in any MISRA deviation process. 21% I formulate formal deviation for projects my team develops. 13% I decide upon informal deviation for projects my team develops. Slightly 3% I evaluate formal deviation records written by others, and 7% I evaluate informal deviation adopted by others.
Okay, very good. So around half of the people here is involved in MISRA deviation, so which is good. So time for the examples. Rule 15.6. The body of an iteration statement or a selection statement should be a compound statement. So you are familiar with the catastrophes that can happen if you avoid a pair of braces. They have reached the press in the not too distant past. It's a required rule, so we have either to comply or to deviate. Here is an example. So we have a macro which is called debounce, And there is a violation of rule 15.6 because, as you see, the body of the if statement, of the selection statement, is not surrounded in braces. So a sensible deviation justification might be this one. The violation is completely innocuous due to the braces of the enclosing compound statement, which is true. And moreover, we suppose it occurs in legacy code that cannot be changed. Okay? So this the main reason of the four that are legitimate that we are invoking here is that this is required because we have adopted code that is not non-compliant. So this macro is contained in a header file that nobody can change. Okay, so if the tool supports that, the best way to do this is to deviate for the debounce macro expansions only. So ideally, the tool should enable you to say, okay, the rule 15.6 is deviated just for the body of the debounce macro. So whenever the debounce macro is expanded. Let's see another example. Directive 4.6. Type defs that indicate size and sightedness should be used in place of the basic numerical types. And this is advisory. However, remember that an advisory guideline may have been recategorized as required or even a mandatory, in which case there is nothing to be done because mandatory cannot be deviated. But it can be recategorized as required, and moreover, if you want to disapply it, you will have to write a justification, a global justification why you disapply it. So don't be spoiled by the fact that it is that its default category is advisory. So here we have an example of violation. We have a type def declaring a type name called status type, and status type has no indication of sidedness and the size. Okay. This is taken from a real-world example. So this is a possible justification for adopted code integration. It's very easy in this case. The status type is mandated by the OSEC standard for real-time operating systems, in which the status type name should be exactly that one. So basically is no choice. So you can consider the OSEC specification as adopted code in the sense that it's a specification that constrains the way you can write code. So you don't have a margin to decide to do things differently. Okay. So if the tool allows you to do this, the thing to be done is to deviate just the status type name with respect to this guideline. Okay. Another example, rule 21.1. You shouldn't define or undefine reserved identifiers or reserved macro names, and the reason is very important. You see, this guideline is required. Because if you fiddle with the reserved names, the implementation can use for any purpose, undefined behavior can happen. And this is a very serious situation. Here we have another real-life example. We have adopted code that uses this in the header files. There are several identifiers which are defined, and these have leading underscores. And so anything that any identifier starting with a leading underscore is a reserved identifier. So the definition of underscore underscore inline underscore underscore is a violation. Okay. for the reason of adopted code integration. This is a possible deviation justification. These defines are used to mark the inlining properties of functions in legacy code. And this is good. It's not enough. They are not used by Wind River Dial Compiler System version 5.9.4, which is the one that we are using in this project. And how did we ascertain this? We checked the manual that this identifier underscore underscore inline underscore underscore is not used by the implementation. Not only this, we have also searched all the header files that are supplied with the compiler. And in a very critical field, I would add we also asked Wind River for confirmation on this, which is better. Okay, so in this case, the best deviation is to deviate precisely the macros for that macros for that guideline. So in this case, we have only one macro, which is underscore underscore inline underscore underscore, but I have to cut down the original example which also defined no inline or never inline and similar identifiers. Here is an example with rule 11.4, advisory but can be recategorized as required. Actually, there is several people that thinks it would be a good idea to recategorize it as required. A conversion should not be performed between a pointer to object and an integer type. Here we have an example. We have to access a status register. So the status register address in the form of a pointer is defined by a macro that presumably is in one of the header files provided by the hardware supplier. And this contains a cast between an integer and the pointer. So this is a violation, and the sensible deviation justification for the reason of access to hardware is that the status register is memory mapped at a fixed address. Okay, so the suggestion here is to deviate precisely the SR macro for that guideline alone. Another example, rule 8.9, an object should be defined at block scope if its identifier only appears in a single function. So it's an advisory that, of course, can be recategorized to required. The objective of the guideline is to reduce the visibility of identifiers in order to minimize the risks. And here we have a violation because this variable is only used in one function. So what might be a sensible justification? In this real-life case, the justification was that the variable could not be local because it had to be accessible via the debugger. And this is mandated by the OSEC standard. And so this is a deviation. We can deviate precisely that variable for that guideline. Note that the suggestion I give in these examples is to be as fine as the tool allows you to be. Okay, with some tool you have no choice but I don't know, disabling the guideline or disabling the guideline for an entire file, or you need to do a proper job. You need a much finer granularity. Another example, function with fixed signatures. The rule is 8.13. A pointer should point to a const qualifier type whenever possible, advisory, but can be recategorized as required. It frequently is because there are usually little reasons to pass something you need not to change with a non-const pointer. Here we have a violation because in this function there is an argument which is the argument called value, which is of type tickref type, which corresponds to unsigned pointer. So you see, non-const unsigned pointer is never used for writing. Again, in this real world example, the reason is in the OSEC standard. It says that the function that corresponds to this one has a fixed signature. So the arguments must be exactly those. Okay, so you don't have control. So one good thing is if the tool, and Claire does this, allows you to list function with fixed signature. So you can write in your Claire configuration the list of function in which the signature is dictated by external considerations, for example, a standard, and then the tool will do the right thing. We have now two examples concerning header inclusion. So the first is with rule 20.1 and also the second, but we have two different ways of deviating. So the rule says that include directives should only be preceded by preprocessor directives or comments, and this is for readability. It is usually important to know what you are including and what you are not including. And ideally, all header file inclusions should come at the beginning of the file, so you know where to look for them. However, there are sensible reasons to deviate. We see one. We have an header file which is called memmap.h, which is actually mandated by Autosar. And so this memmap.h may have to be included in places that are not at the beginning of a translation unit. So this is a good reason to deviate for adopted code integration. And you should, if the tool allows you to do this, deviate the included header file, memmap.h. So all header files should be included at the beginning of the file. I'm simplifying, of course. But memmap.h can be included at any point in a translation unit or in another header file. Same rule. However, this case is slightly different because it is not the included file that is special. It is the includer file that is special. And the real-world example, the source, the translation unit is written like this. It has sections with headings. There is a type def here. And then there is an inclusion here for system services.h. So this is a violation because there are code tokens before this inclusion. However, the point here is that what makes this case special is the includer. So here is a justification. Even though inclusions in this header file could be moved upward, for readability, the author decided to follow the structure of the OSEC standard. The OSEC standard is divided into sections. So section 13.3 is interrupt handling, and then we have 13.3.1 data types, and then okay. So for code readability, it is decided that we will follow this structure even if it violates rule 20.1. So in this case, we do not deviate the included header file, we deviate the common includer. Okay, it is that one that is special. Let us, we are near to the end of the webinar. So an important thing in the art of deviation is to perform exchanges. Okay, so when you cannot avoid a deviation, it's not necessarily the best thing to be done to deviate the violation you are seeing. You can change the code and deviate something else. So it's a little bit as in the game of chess, where an exchange or trade of pieces may be advantageous. Okay. So a typical case, instead of deviating one guideline multiple times, change the code a little bit and raise one deviation for something you can more easily control. So here we have an example. Here we have a type def of an enumerated type that we called ET, enumerated type. And we have a function taking an argument of type ET called X. Then we want to iterate between the enumeration constants from A to C in this case. However, when we use the pre-increment operator here, we are violating rule 10.1, which says that you should use an appropriate, you should have an appropriate essential type for each operator. And in the case of the pre-increment operator, you need to have an integer, not an enumerated type. So this is a violation. So instead of deviating rule 10.1 in this for loop, and maybe in 10 others or 100 other places throughout the code, a sensible thing to be done is to change the code as follows. Okay, we iterate over integers here, casting an enumerated object to an integer object is perfectly well defined. It is not a MISRA violation, so these casts are well formed and they are not MISRA violation. And in order to obtain an object of type ET, which is what the function G expects, we call function safely convert to ET, okay? And we pass it to I. And this is static inline, so with a good compiler, it will basically very, very efficient. And if we have the macro extra runtime checks, which is defined, then we can even do more. So we actually check that the value passed is within the allowed range, and if not, we call a fail-safe function. Okay, if extra runtime checks is not defined, we simply cast the integer to the enumerated type. This is a violation of rule 10.5, but we deviate it once and in a very controlled environment, which is this one. Okay, instead of possibly deviating dozens of loops like this one. Conclusion. So we have addressed the topic of MISRA deviation. I hope to have conveyed the right ideas, and in particular to have expressed the spirit and the letter of the official MISRA documents, because in the end this is what is more important if we are talking about MISRA compliance. There are some important messages, I believe, in this webinar. So deviation is an integral part of the MISRA process. Deviation should be planned and possibly negotiated between the acquirer and supplier before the project starts, because otherwise, if you have discussions at the time when the project is almost finished and has been delivered, this is a nightmare, because the discussion will end up, you don't know how. If you are forced to make changes, you will have to repeat a lot of activities. You will have to repeat testing, peer reviews, and so on. Okay, deviation and compliance both have costs. So the cost of deviating and the cost of complying, this is something you have to think carefully about, and to make sure that you do the most convenient decision. And a good tool will go a long way to reduce both costs. And again, training. Training is essential in order to make the right choices. Okay, so if there are questions, I can try to answer them.
Okay, thank you, Roberto. A couple of questions. Let's go with the first one. Is it really not possible to deviate a mandatory rule?
No, it is not possible. So if it is a mandatory rule, if MISRA has decided that the rule is mandatory, you really have to comply with the rule. If a recategorization has been of an advisory of a required rule has mapped the rule to mandatory, then of course this the fact that you find yourself in the position where you want to deviate it implies that the recategorization was not well thought in advance. So in this case, you would have the possibility of change the recategorization plan.
Okay, next question is a tiny long one, so you might want to check it in the Q&A section whilst I read it. On a slide about a needed deviation in a specific place, you have said that if the tool does not allow other things, I have to disable the whole rule. How is it possible to justify that? And in general, if the scope of my deviation is too wide, how can I justify it without lying?
Well, without lying, you can say the truth. So if the tool does not allow anything better, this is one of the considerations you have to do possibly at the outset of a project, and this is also a matter of possible agreement or disagreement between acquirer and supplier. So as we have seen in the previous webinar, which you can find in our YouTube channel, it was about MISRA compliance. So the first thing that you have to do is to have a guideline enforcement plan, a GEP. In order to properly compile a guideline enforcement plan, you will have to take into account, you have to plan the use of the tools that you have to make. Typically, the GEP is something that acquirer and supplier should be should agree upon, and so also the tool often is a matter of negotiation between. I must say that if the tool doesn't support the deviation, the finer granularity deviation mechanism, the only thing you can do is do not disable the rule, hope you don't have many violations, and you justify them a posteriori. So the tool will present all of them, and you will have to examine all of them and make sure that they do not pose any risk. Whereas if the tool has fine ways of delimiting the violation, it will be much easier for you, because you will only be presented with the remaining reports that you have to justify.
Okay, in the example where ++I was used by violating Rule 10.4, the proposed solution will complicate the code a lot. The original non-compliant code was much more readable than the compliant one. Is this still compliant with MISRA spirit?
I don't think it is much more complex. So let's factorize the two things. So the function safely convert to ET was not present in the original, but it's just one function. You write it once in the entire project. It has added value because you see this bit, the part between sorry, the part between the sharp if def and the sharp and if is extra checking code you may want to enable or disable. Nobody forces you to have that. So this, if you want, you shouldn't count it as extra complication. So it's an extra features that have been added in an attempt to present a sensible solution. And here you have this cast that violates rule 10.5. And so I guess you mean that here you have two casts here, one which is MISRA compliant, but it makes it clear that you are iterating over integer over 32-bit signed integers, and you are using the increment operator in a MISRA compliant way. And so no, I disagree on the fact that this is significantly more complex. So.
Okay, next question. If the tool does not enforce a rule, how to check it? Do you suggest to check it manually?
You can, yes, in the guideline enforcement plan, you have to take into account all the guidelines of MISRA C 2012. And so if the tool doesn't support or doesn't fully support a guideline, you have to find alternative way of compliance. So this is the purpose of the GEPs, of the guideline enforcement plan. So you may have to change tool, for example. And in some cases, as in the case of undecidable rules, the tool will by necessity be incomplete. This doesn't mean that you are lost. You can still change the code, improve the code to make it fall within the tool limitations. But yes, this is basically the thing.
As an evaluator of the report, how can I ensure that all MISRA rules are checked by the tool? Can you suggest the best practice?
Yes, as this is something we discussed in the previous webinar. I may have the slides still here. I hope so, at least no, now I'm not finding it immediately. Let's take MISRA Compliance 2020. In order to claim compliance, claiming compliance. Okay, the guideline compliance summary. So in the end, a MISRA claim should be supported by documents. One of the documents is the guideline compliance summary, and for each MISRA guideline there should be a row in this table saying if you are compliant, if you are compliant with deviations, or if it has been disapplied. Okay, so when you check the documentation, you should, the documentation provided with the project, you should check that the status is what you expect. So all the guidelines should be mentioned in the guideline compliance summary, and whenever you have compliance, it's okay. Whenever you have deviations as part of the material provided, you should have deviation records for each of the deviation. if the guideline has been disapplied, you have to have a rationale for this application, and that's it. And also when the tool produce a high quality reports, as is the case for Eclair. So we have designed Eclair to support even the most demanding safety critical sectors. And the final report, the rules that were enabled are explicitly listed. And the configuration is presented in a numbered decimal notation, so you can easily check that they are all there. Say it another way, it is not possible to disable a rule and hiding this from the final report unless you fiddle with the final report, which is a fraud, which we don't even think about.
Okay, Roberto, thank you very much. And thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. Of course, if more questions come to mind, you can always drop us an email at info@bugseng.com. Also, if you'd like to see this webinar again or share it with your colleagues, head to our YouTube channel. We will upload the recording very shortly. In general, that's a good spot to find very interesting videos from previous webinars as well. Today's webinar will be followed by a practical sequel that is not yet in the full schedule. So if you'd like to know when this is going to be, perhaps follow us on LinkedIn. We will surely post the new date there. Anyway, we are thinking sometime in September. Hold on, let me remind you that next webinar will be implicit conversion in C, the hidden enemy, on July 16th, which is in 2 weeks from now. Right, that's it. Thank you again for attending, and I hope to hear from all of you very, very soon. Bye-bye. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.